In this video, we're going to talk about the recipe, and also we will move on to a little bit more about cost control. So let's talk about the recipes, types of recipes, and then also get a little bit more detail about standardized recipes. Okay, so a basic recipe, all of you guys know what that is. It's basically a set of instructions for preparing whatever item that you want to make. Now, there is a huge difference between what we call home-style recipes and also ones that we call standardized recipes. They are very different in the fact that a home-style recipe typically expects that the cook who will be making that recipe has some sort of cooking knowledge, has some sort of cooking judgment, something that we'll talk about in a little bit. But what that basically means is you may have a recipe that calls for 2 lemons. Now, in a commercial kitchen or in a restaurant, 2 lemons, that is a very vague description of a product that you may need. 2 lemons could be very tiny, 2 lemons could be very big. Same goes for any type of fruit, any type of vegetable. Let's use 2 butternut squashes. They could be maybe, 3 inches, they could be half a pound, or they could be 6 pounds. So a home-style recipe is very vague. A standardized recipe is much more detailed, and those are the types that we use in food service operations. So a standardized recipe will have much more detailed instructions. It's going to tell you a particular way to prepare a specific dish. Now, this one that we have here as an example, this even tells you, what amounts we need when we want to make a certain amount of servings, if we want to double those servings, preparation instructions that tell you exactly how to make this specific dish so that it comes out the same every single time. Now, typically, what do standardized recipes include? So, all these items on the list are what a standardized recipe should include because they're important. They help you know what you are going to be making. They help you let you know what you're going to need. One of the things that I like to add to this list as well is the shelf life. I think that a standardized recipe should also include a shelf life. And a shelf life is not necessarily when a recipe will go bad. It actually, a food's shelf life deems that product no longer as good of a quality as when it was first made. So when we see a shelf life in a restaurant, let's say on a dressing, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you eat the dressing, it's going to make you sick. It just means that it's not as good as if it was first made. Typically, it means that it might separate, it might curdle, whatever that may be. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to make you go bad. The same thing could be said for if you have buffets. I always think of, I think it's Cici's Pizza that does a pizza buffet. Now, all of us know that a pizza that comes right out of the oven tastes very different than a pizza that had been sitting under a heat lamp for 3 hours. So that's the type of shelf life. Am I asking the customer to pay the same price for a product, and we are ensuring that it still is exactly the same quality as if it was first made? So I do believe that those should also be included on standardized recipes. So how does the standardized recipes help us control costs in a restaurant? Well, 2 things. They typically help us with consistency, and also quality, because whether you have one employee or another employee making a recipe, if they are sticking to the rules, to the standard recipes, they're going to come out the same. So for the guest, they should be getting the same product. The other thing is standardized recipes really help us cost out how much each recipe costs, exactly like what we did in class, costing out the braised red cabbage recipe. So for a restaurateur or a chef, we know exactly how much each product in that recipe costs and how much we need to charge for that product, or if we need to switch out some ingredients. So let's say a specific vinegar that we're using in, let's say, the braised red cabbage recipe, all of a sudden goes up in price for whatever reason. Having a standardized recipe and seeing that it went up in price, hence went up in food costs, it would allow us to make a change and get another vinegar or whatever that may be to replace it to make sure that we keep the cost down. So all of that stuff is very important, and standardized recipes definitely help us achieve that. All right, this is going back to what does it mean to cook with judgment. So this is when we say every recipe typically assumes some sort of little bit of knowledge that you may have. Cook until done. To people, that could be very vague. I personally like all of my fish medium rare. So to a lot of people, if I serve them salmon the way that I like it, which is medium rare, they would say that that salmon is not done, that is undercooked. So that could be a little bit different. Typically in more of a standardized recipe, we will tell you what internal temperature you should bring a specific item to. Make it a moderate oven. What does that mean? I mean, that is, to some people, that's 365, to some people, it's 350, some people, that's 300. It really, same thing. That's kind of what people assume. Bake until center is firm, cook until the mixture just begins to thicken. I mean, all of these things basically are ones that eventually, when you start cooking, you're going to have some sort of basic knowledge that helps you make this judgment that makes you a great chef. Like Bobby Flay, whenever you watch him, he basically, you don't see him looking at recipes. He has the judgment. He knows exactly what he's doing. He knows how long to cook something for. He knows exactly how much seasoning to add. And that basically just comes with practice. Remember, all food products are not uniform. This is why having calorie counts on menus is so tricky for us, especially if we're making things from scratch. Those of you guys that have ever made, let's say, apple pie or something along those lines, you know that you could be using Granny Smith apples, but depending on which orchard they came from or where or how long they've been picked, their sugar content is quite different. Some might be super, super, super tart and super bitter, and some might have started turning a little bit and became sweeter. So ultimately, that's going to augment how much sugar you're going to put into your apple pie, because if your apple is already quite sweet, you're not going to want to put as much sugar in. So those are all things that we might have to change. And going back to the menu labeling, that is why a lot of restaurants that make food from scratch, they have a range of, a specific item is this many calories. And that's the reason, because we are still, for the most part, humans making food, and a lot of things can change. So that kind of helps them protect themselves against lawsuits. All right. So how can you learn to cook with judgment? This picture I thought was hysterical. I literally, this picture was labeled good-looking people dancing and cooking. I don't know. Things you can find. So how can you learn to cook with judgment? Obviously, practice makes perfect. So basically, the more cooking that you do, the better you're going to get. Some of you have done this. Some of you have been cooking for, it seems, forever, and you have this judgment. Some of you may be a little nervous about cooking, for the first time in 2 weeks or 3 weeks in lab, because it's just not something that you do all that time. I guarantee you that whichever spectrum of that you're at, if you consider yourself a good cook, or if you're just not a good one at all, through the course of this class with the lab, you're going to get better. And definitely your judgment as far as cooking is related, it's going to improve. How are ingredients measured? Now, on Wednesday, you are actually going to do a really cool part of lab where you are going to get to see how different things are measured. And you're actually going to get to compare and contrast using a cup, like a measuring cup, and also weighing items, and what a difference that makes in specific products. Some you might find doesn't make a difference at all. Some you might find makes a hell of a difference. So, and you obviously now knowing that cooking there's a science related to it, and especially baking. Trust me, I can't bake, but it definitely makes a difference if you are off on a specific ingredient. So when we're looking at different types of weight, so we call ingredients AP and EP. Now AP is the as purchase. Now we can have an as purchase weight. Now this relates to something before you start cooking anything, trimming anything, removing pits or skins or anything like that, bones. So that is the weight of an actual item. So picture something like a carrot, and you buy it and it's beautiful. It's one of those, like, it's like you can buy them at Whole Foods, the whole carrot, and then you have the green stem and it's beautiful. Well, when you're a restaurateur, that actually, when you look at that, you say, well, that's actually a waste of money, because you know that that carrot, prior to using it, you're going to have to cut off a little bit at the tip, then a little at the end, all that green stuff, that's basically garbage. You're going to need to throw it out, and then you're going to need to peel it. So all of that stuff that you have to remove, you have to pay for, but then you're just going to throw it away. So when we actually measure ingredients, it makes a huge difference whether or not the weight is AP, meaning how it's purchased, or EP, which means edible portion, which is how that product is actually the usable product that we have. So those are two different things, and they're very important as far as ingredients. Now, obviously, weight measures how heavy an item is, and volume measures how much space an item fills. So typically, we use volume measures for liquids and small amounts of herbs and spices. That means that typically anything else you would have to weigh. A lot of you guys are looking at, I don't know, I always use a measuring cup for, let's say, flour or sugar. Well, if you look at true baking recipes, you will never see a cup of sugar. You will always see a weight, because that is always more accurate. There are certain items that we measure by count, and you will see some recipes that call for this: eggs, cloves of garlic, something, especially there's some fresh herbs that typically will ask for, 2 sprigs of rosemary or something like that. So that is also an ingredient measure that we look at. How are portions measured? So if you've ever worked in a restaurant, you know that you're looking at portion control. We're always looking at how portions are served. This goes back to standardized recipe. It not only helps us provide the same product every single time, so that the guest relates the price to the product, and it doesn't matter when they come in, it's always the same thing. It also helps us make sure that the cost of the recipe is the same every single time. So we look at count, weight, volume, different measuring spoons, but just like the picture, we want to ensure that every single product is exactly the same way. So we already discussed AP and EP weight. So this is just kind of going over to what I already talked about. Now, avocado is another perfect example. So if you look at this specific avocado, you see it has a huge pit inside, and it has the outside skin on it. And so this would be considered the AP product. And then after you remove everything else, you definitely will have some AP. Now, this is very important. Let's say you're making guacamole, and it calls for, you want to get a certain volume of guacamole to serve for the evening. You would make sure that your recipe is in EP and not an AP, so that you get the right amount. So for the next few, this is just a way for you to make sure you go over this, and this will help you definitely complete your homework assignments, so you can read these and kind of get a better understanding. Costing out recipes, portion control, food cost percentage. This is something hopefully you will go over in HMGT 208. But basically, we need to make sure that in order to make a profit, or hopefully make a profit from a specific item, we need to make sure that we understand how much the actual product costs us to make. So that is why, and that's really the biggest thing that we can control. So we need to ensure that we know and we understand exactly how much everything costs. Who should care about food costs? Every single person. Every single person that has anything to do with a plate of food going out to a customer needs to understand what waste does, how that helps or hurts food costs, inconsistent portioning, waste, human error. That's all important. Everyone should care about food costs and portion control. So what helps portion control? Obviously, standardized recipes, understanding our costs, what the hidden costs are, how to make sure that we have portion control, and food costs. Now, these are the formulas that you will be using for your homework assignment, so make sure you go over them, and this is what we handed out in class. Review the rest of this PowerPoint, maybe go back, read your chapters. This will also help you complete your homework assignment. It's just your weights and measures, so just make sure that you pay attention to all of that with your homework assignment.